Hello, this is Fiona Cuthbertson coming from the pod to record another episode of Off the Cuff. This week we're lucky enough to have Charlie Dewhirst MP. Charlie's been the MP for Bridlington and the Wolds since 2024. Before entering Parliament, he was a councillor in both Hammersmith and Yorkshire and deputy leader of East Riding of Yorkshire Council. He was intrinsic in the introduction of the Groceries Code Adjudicator, which looks to regulate the relationship between supermarkets and their direct suppliers to improve fairness in the supply chain. He has taken this desire to ensure things are done to the highest standards into Parliament by being very outspoken regarding the necessity for standards in public life. Welcome, Charlie.
Good afternoon.
So, can you tell us a bit about your political journey and what got you into politics?
It's been 20 years or so since I first got involved in active politics, just ahead of the 2005 general election. And I'd grown up in a safe Conservative seat, largely in East Yorkshire, been to university in a safe Labour seat in Edinburgh, and suddenly found myself having moved down to London in a marginal constituency for the first time. And my sort of political motivation at that point was a lot to do with rural issues, very important to us locally, where there'd been big policy changes by Labour which had affected farming in our area. And I saw an opportunity then, as a natural progression, was to get involved in Conservative politics and try and take the fight to Labour in a Labour-held seat in Hammersmith and Fulham. And it's a dangerous, slippery slope. I sent an email volunteering my sort of services to deliver leaflets, and here I am 20 years later as a Member of Parliament. So be careful what emails you send and what you volunteer for. But it was great. We won the seat. I got involved in the council elections the following year, stood in an unwinnable ward, then became a councillor in 2010 and then did that for 8 years and stood for Parliament twice as well during that time in Hammersmith. It's been a long journey, but it's been a great one.
And how did your previous career, both in sports broadcasting as a public affairs professional, prepare you for the Commons?
I'm not sure anything really prepares you for the Commons. I have worked in some quite high-stress environments in sport, particularly when you're doing things like organising major events. My previous sporting role prior to COVID was as head of comms, the Cycling World Championships, and there are few events more stressful than when you're trying to close 1,000 kilometres of road in a week, and all the fun and games that comes with that, and closing down a town centre in Yorkshire for 2 weeks. So those kind of things do prepare you for that kind of last-minute push and pull of what life is like in Westminster, and the kind of non-stop nature of the role and the hours you've got to put in just to get things done.
Absolutely. And if you could be remembered for one thing, what would it be?
As I said in my main speech, on a very basic level, if I can leave this place having made East Yorkshire a better place to live and work, I'd like to be able to say that we will achieve some of those bigger projects locally, delivering on infrastructure that's very, very important to us. And, I'd like to say, hopefully, make my mark in a way I can. Politics is a fluid environment. So it's difficult to see, particularly in the current times, where things are going. So I'm just concentrating on what I can to do the best by my constituents.
Coming back to that, they say that a week is a long time in politics, and this means events can overtake you. Have there been any times when you've had to grow and develop because of a situation that's not gone according to plan?
I think a lot of the time you feel here things maybe aren't going according to plan. I mean, things change very rapidly in terms of just your daily routine and what you're doing. Obviously, those of us that have been involved in election campaigns, things can go pretty wrong pretty quickly through no fault of your own, because often as a candidate, whether it's at the local level or national level, you are blown by the winds of the national media. And I think, when you're, as we were this time just over a year ago, out knocking on doors, you suddenly see the headlines, something flashes up on your phone, oh my God, have you seen what's happened? There were a couple of incidents, things like D-Day, betting, that just threw you off course, even though it was not your fault. You had no control over it, but suddenly it was the only conversation you were having on the doorstep.
So what's the hardest challenge you've had to overcome?
In the political sense, I think one of the biggest challenges you have is getting elected. Being the figurehead as a parliamentary candidate is always difficult because you have a team of volunteers. This is not like a normal job where you might be line managing people who are paid by an organisation. You are literally having to look after volunteers who are giving up their time for free. And that in itself is always interesting. And you've got to make sure that you can bring everyone on that journey. You have to accept that not all of them are going to get on with each other. And there's a bit of management goes on with that. You can spend quite a bit of time making sure that things are running as smoothly as they can. And often that can be a little bit of a distraction. What you should be doing, which of course is speaking to people on the doorstep. But that kind of challenge is part and parcel of politics.
Talking of your time on the doorstep, what's the best compliment you've ever received?
You're not as stupid as you look. Or maybe that's the worst insult, man. Could be either. I think the nicest compliment you can get is really a thank you for when you've been able to achieve something to make someone's life better. Because actually it is a struggle. A lot of people come to you often in desperation and often dealing with situations which are quite challenging to overcome. So whenever you get that opportunity to make a difference and to speak to that person afterwards, makes my job very much worthwhile.
And coming back to you're not as stupid as you look, what is the worst insult that you are most proud of?
The insult, the insult I've received, or
Either that you received or you've given to someone else.
because most of the insults I've received in politics probably aren't repeatable. But I have to say, 99% of people are very polite. We do get a lot of abuse, particularly online. It's not, when you meet people in person, it's a very different situation. I don't know, I could get myself in trouble for saying some of the insults I might have dished out, particularly my job of making sure we keep the noise up in PMQs every week. I did get in trouble the other day for, I say in trouble, actually, I made the Chancellor laugh, which was a change. But when she was in the spending review statement, she was talking about the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and she has a sort of spiel about how he's been going through the books and the assets and the liabilities. And it was just sort of that moment where everything went quiet, and I just shouted, "Who's the liability?" Which, to be fair, even she laughed, which was...
Well, it's better that she was laughing than crying, as she has.
Indeed, indeed.
As you said before, you stood for Parliament a number of times before being elected in 2024. And obviously when you were elected, that was a night when many colleagues lost their seats. Can you talk us through the emotions of that evening? Yeah,
it is very challenging. So I stood twice previously, so both times in Hammersmith in 15 and 17. So I've had 3 very different election nights, actually. The first one, 2015, when I lost, we had a fantastic result nationally as a Conservative Party. And it was nice, even though I'd lost, to be part of the wider winning team. 17 was not good because that was the election, when you recall, we were 20 points ahead of the polls when the election was first called, and that went horribly wrong. That was a very difficult night. But of course, 2024, when you are personally elected, and then you see lots of friends of mine that I've known for many years who did a really good job as members of Parliament suddenly lose their seats, that's really challenging. In some ways, it's easier to be individual loser on a winning team than be a winner when you've taken such a beating.
And we are 1 year into a Labour government. So coming back to the liability idea, how do you think the government has done so far?
I don't think any of us envisaged the first year they have had. I think most of us would have expected a honeymoon period that one typically gets when after a landslide victory. Clearly, they've made huge mistakes in terms of policies since then. And we can see that now that the confidence sort of in the Prime Minister and the government is very, very low. These mistakes are all entirely of their own making. There are a number of examples, but just taking the winter fuel payment for one, that obviously was a huge error, and one that after having taken a year's worth of political pain, they've now reversed. And it just seems to be misstep after misstep. It is frankly quite surprising that they don't look like they were ready for government when everybody else, certainly the polls, were suggesting otherwise.
You talk about the winter fuel allowance and the U-turn that's happened. There have been a number of government rebellions. Do you think the Labour leadership can ride it out? Do you think there'll be changes within the cabinet?
I think that would have to happen anyway, because you do need to have those regular reshuffles. Maybe we went a bit far in our last government. But in terms of obviously changing the top team, that's a good reason perhaps to shake it up. The degradation of the parliamentary party in terms of unity is going to be a long-term challenge for them, though, because we saw that as a Conservative government in the last 5 years, and how increasingly difficult it became to manage the parliamentary party. And one of the reasons I'm sure that the election ended up being called slightly earlier than everyone expected was because it was just becoming harder and harder to manage members of parliament. And that appears to be the case now with Sama, and he may have another 4 years of this. So something will have to change.
We've briefly mentioned about the Chancellor, just coming back to that again, because it was such an unusual situation for the Chancellor to burst into tears in the chamber. As I say, some deep emotions there. So is she allowed to be human, or does it show that she's out of her depth?
I have to say, being sat there, it was absolutely excruciating to watch. It was awful. I was in the chamber for the previous half an hour of departmental questions, which is when she first burst into tears, and she left, and then she came back. I don't know who's advising her, but clearly the state she was in, she should not have been allowed back into the chamber. She was not in the right frame of mind, and she sat there, and it was as if Keir Starmer on one side of her and the Education Secretary on the other side of her ignored her presence, ignored the state she was in. And it was awful. I'm baffled as to why she had to sit there and do it. Clearly, for whatever reason had upset her, it doesn't matter what it was, no one should be forced to sit there in front of millions of people. The only time of the week when lots of people are actually watching Parliament, and I felt it was almost humiliating. I felt genuinely very sorry for her.
So it isn't actually particularly reported that she'd actually burst into tears before that?
The press didn't widely pick that up, and the fact that she had the opportunity to leave once and come back. If, as you say, she'd broken down during Prime Minister's questions, that would have been a more difficult thing to get up and walk out of. But I don't think she should have been allowed back in there. It wasn't fair on her.
Almost a deliberate humiliation, one might say.
That was certainly my feeling as I was sat there just a few yards from her. It was just a terrible, terrible thing.
You've written a number of questions on government transparency. Is this a problem in the Labour Party and or politics in general?
Transparency is an important part of the political process. I've certainly discovered over the last year, now this is going back to when I was working in Parliament 20 years ago, getting answers out of ministers wasn't always easy. It felt easier then than it is now. And when we've tried to get to the bottom of things through written questions, it feels like the blockers are bigger than they used to be. And there's always an excuse why they can't tell you something. And that's happening not just to me, but to colleagues across the board. That is something we're trying to get a grip on. We are trying to take the battle to the government through the mechanisms we have to ensure that there is transparency and that MPs should be able to ask those questions and get an answer.
Maybe it would be an interesting thing to assess how many of the questions that are asked actually get the response, this information is not held centrally, because I know that you've had a number of those answers just very recently. So do you think enough is being done to ensure the government are held to high standards of public office?
We are raising it at the highest possible level that we can through the Speaker's Office and others to try and ensure that the table office, who are the middlemen, if you like, between the government departments and the MPs asking these questions, to ensure that they are supporting the MPs as best they can to get those questions tabled and then answered. We've had a number recently where they just come back and say this information is available on Govt.uk, which is not very helpful because good luck finding it. And again, a clear attempt to misdirect. One of the bigger challenges is getting the question down in the first place, actually, at the moment, getting it into a form that is acceptable to not necessarily the table office. It seems to me that government departments are pushing back hard on questions. So that's a concern because that's not what they should be doing.
That's very interesting, actually, because having been intrinsically involved in the development of business rates relief for retailers, even if a question was asked and they couldn't give anything more than information, they did actually direct you directly to that information. They didn't just say gov.uk. That's outrageous that they're just not giving you any guidance. That's not what it's all for, is it?
No. We are, as elected members of Parliament, it is a very important method and way in which we, particularly as opposition parties, can hold the government to account. And if they are trying to stop us doing that, then that is not a good thing for democracy.
Coming back to the fact that you are now fielding shadow teams, you've raised a number of issues. You've obviously mentioned farming previously, cybersecurity, science, energy. What would be your top priorities? Is it farming because of your constituency, or is there anything else that you're particularly interested in at the moment?
The main priorities on a local level. For my constituency, obviously the rural economy, which includes farming, but also the wider rural economy, which is obviously connectivity, both broadband transport, and then Bridlington being the lobster capital of Europe and largest shellfish landing port in the UK. Fishing element is very important to us, particularly the EU-UK relations on fishing, and then the challenges that we have in both rural and coastal areas around access to services, particularly health services, dentistry, outpatient appointments. So those are the things that's been sort of taking up most of my time in terms of my parliamentary work. But then I do try and also to take an interest in things that are not just the constituency side of things. I've been involved in the least of politics through the Abraham Accords and other such things where I've taken a sort of keener interest recently and looking forward to doing more work on those things.
Absolutely. And one part of your job is to be a legislator. So how can legislation development ensure people's lives are improved through change?
It's important, for my first year and having now sat on bill committees where you go through line by line and ensuring that what comes forward to Parliament, and this is the responsibility of government, is legislation that is going to achieve what it should achieve for the better of the nation, and also is fit for purpose in terms of the way it's drafted, because actually what we're finding at the moment, and we certainly found with this first tranche of bills that were brought before Parliament after the King's speech, that they were clearly very rushed. You can just tell by the number of government amendments that have had to go in to correct the legislation that they themselves have drafted. It's the first time I've had the opportunity to do the sort of line-by-line work. It isn't the most sexy and exciting stuff in the world, and you won't see it on TV, the bill committees, but it's really important that is our key role, ultimately, as opposition members scrutinising the government's legislative agenda.
And do you think parliamentary process could be strengthened to make your job in making these changes easier?
As good as I think it can be. I know it's not always exciting, and you've got to get into the weeds of these things. There is a process that needs to go through. I think if you look at the Commons and the Lords, that's generally okay. There are, of course, examples where people will feel that there hasn't been sufficient scrutiny of legislation. We've had a couple of examples recently, particularly on controversial amendment to government legislation around abortion, and also on the assisted dying bill, which of course was a private member's bill, and many felt it wasn't perhaps given the time it should have been, but then in the end we did have sort of 3 Fridays of it. There are examples of where, yes, we could do better, but I think on the whole it isn't a bad system.
Talking of that, though, it is going to change soon with the elimination of the hereditary peers from the Lords. How is that going to affect the way that the parliamentary process works? Or is it just getting rid of old wood?
I think that's be very unfair on my colleagues at the upper house. I think there's some really, really brilliant expertise within that cohort of peers. I think it's a great shame that the government's moved so quickly to remove them. They are some of the hardest working in the House of Lords, perhaps because they're the elected ones, because they have to actually fight an election to get the spot in there. I think that motivates them to work hard. I don't see the Lords being a better place without them, so I think it's a shame.
And finally, obviously, politics doesn't work in a vacuum. You have people listening and engaging around what you do all the time within your constituency and beyond. So what can our listeners do to fight the fight and ensure that Parliament works as it should and that the government is held to account?
Well, feel particularly strongly about the way things are going. Get involved. Whatever your viewpoint, whether it's a Conservative viewpoint or otherwise, I think it's important that people do engage in the political process. And that obviously is done best through joining a party and getting involved in activism and that side of it. Also, don't just sit at home and moan at the telly. Do get in touch with your local member of Parliament. Make sure they know what you think, because that's really important. And the more that we hear from our constituents, the better informed we are to work here.
Charlie, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been very interesting to hear about what drives you, what's going on in your local constituency, and get more of an insight about things that go on in the chamber that people might not actually get to see, even though it's still televised. Thank you to the listeners who've hopefully enjoyed the show as much as we've enjoyed making it. If you have any questions regarding the podcast today, please feel free to comment. If you think it's worth coming back, please like and subscribe. If you feel you need something to tide you over to the next podcast, please buy my Put Party Games on Amazon. And on that note, I'll see you next time. Hope you have a good week, one and all.